So most of my subscribers are American and a lot of them are British as well, but it's safe to say most people who watch my content are either from Britain or the US. But I've always found it interesting how there's some parallels between our two countries' politics, and obviously it's not too surprising because a lot of the founding fathers in America were English descendants and obviously influenced a lot by English culture. But after World War II, there's been numerous instances where the world economy has been bad, where people's values are changing, and it's seen the rise of certain politicians. So I'm going to get into how Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders are sort of rising together at this present moment. But to get into some historical context, obviously, I think from the title of my video, you will know who I'm talking about. So Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were two people who rose together. Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Tory party and Prime Minister in 1979. Ronald Reagan was elected President of the US in 1980 and he became President in 1981, obviously when he was inaugurated. But it's interesting in terms of the world economy and world events and everything shaped these two people's rise. So the 1970s was a bad time for the world. You had various oil crises in the Middle East. You had things like the Yom Kippur War between the Arabs and Israel. You had OPEC, really raising their prices and threatening not to sell to people. And OPEC, of course, is the bloc of the countries that produce the most oil in the world. So back then in the 70s, it's obviously a way bigger deal than it is now because they had sort of a monopoly on all the oil and they were just threatening people who supported Israel essentially. So this led to real economic turmoil. You had massive inflation, you had prices at the pumps going up and stuff, and obviously Jimmy Carter had to deal with all this stuff. And because he was seen weak in foreign policy when he really wasn't, this led to the rise of Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan's whole thing really was being an anti-communist. That pretty much was it. He wasn't a very intelligent guy, but he was a very good speaker and he was a good actor in terms of what he's done in politics. And like traditional conservatives, he would just bang on about how weak Democrats are and how strong Republicans are going to be. And he promised, really ramp up tensions with the Soviet Union because he was such an anti-communist. And then obviously when he got into office, he started doing the arms race. He pushed forward all these crazy proposals like the Star Wars program, which was never close to reality, but he thought it was because he was so out of touch with reality. But he was a warmonger and he was a traditional conservative, but he was seen as quite far right in his day. We might look back at him now and be like, Ronald Reagan, he's pretty traditional for a new Republican because, he unleashed this evangelical Christianity on America in terms of really politicizing it. And there was a really clear through line between Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. He gave us Donald Trump, essentially. He was the first Trump. So he was quite far right for his day. And he let all these war hawks essentially run riot in his administration, tax cuts for billionaires, and really favouring this sort of meritocracy that doesn't exist. Also expanded things like the war on drugs really, really greatly and US imperialism in Latin America. He was a really conservative guy, but by today's standards, he seems pretty ordinary for a Republican, which is quite depressing. And then you have Margaret Thatcher, so she's very conservative as well, sort of in the mould of Ronald Reagan, but more a traditional conservative, a lot smarter than Ronald Reagan because obviously conservatives in the UK pride themselves on going to Eton, going to Oxbridge and stuff in a way that Republicans don't. In the US, there's not as high value placed in education, especially now. But she's very smart, she's pretty ruthless, bit of a warmonger as well. We see that with the Falklands War, because in the 70s, conservatives were thinking about giving the Falklands back to Argentina, and a lot of people didn't care about the Falklands, but she helped rally everyone around it, and it's probably the highlight of her premiership is doing this. But she also oversaw massive cuts to public spending, really putting jobs overseas. She devastated port towns, she devastated mining towns because she moved industry overseas. And it's pretty similar to what people like Ronald Reagan were doing as well, but obviously the UK were doing that a bit more at the time because we just didn't have the capacity to do this stuff anymore. She also privatised lots of industries as well, so she really destroyed the working class in this country. And it's like Ronald Reagan, crushing unions. I think it's the Air Traffic Controllers Union is probably the most infamous one, but he's obviously not great for the working class either. But these two anti-communists came in, it ended the détente period in the Cold War, ramped up tensions with the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, and it was sort of these economic conditions that really gave us these two people promising all this stuff to make the countries great and everything, but in reality really hurting the working class. And now you have Tony Blair and Bill Clinton. So Bill Clinton got elected in 1992, Tony Blair got elected in 1997, so a bit of a difference between them, but they were both elected as young new leaders straight after the Cold War, and they sort of abandoned their party's left-leaning roots. So Bill Clinton is nothing like FDR, Tony Blair is nothing like, I guess, Wilson or, old leaders like Ramsay MacDonald and stuff like that. He really abandoned what Labour was and made them more conservative. So both of these figures moved their parties to the right wing. They're more pro corporations. They're more pro-war. And they abandoned what made these parties great in the first place in a lot of ways. And they abandoned the foundations of these parties. And what this appealed to was the new sort of middle class growing after the Cold War, and the middle class in these countries as they became more wealthy, especially the UK was becoming more wealthy in this period because post-war we've been very poor for a long time. But unlike Conservatives, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair had the shiny liberal face. They were very liberal people, they were very young people, and that's what made them so appealing. They were like your typical politicians that you imagine today. Very socially progressive, very financially conservative, and as I've made a video before, I don't think that is a real position because you can't be one without the other, I feel. So these are two new people who rose at the same time. Tony Blair obviously stuck around a lot longer than Bill Clinton because in the UK the term limits are longer and there's really no cap on how long someone can be Prime Minister. So Tony Blair, I think it was 2007, he resigned. So it's a bit different to Bill Clinton. But yeah, at the same time, they worked together, they had pretty good friendship and stuff, just like Margaret Thatcher and Reagan had a good friendship. They worked together with the Northern Ireland issues and everything. And I think there's a good film where Michael Sheen reprises his role as Tony Blair and shows this relationship between them, especially during the Monica Lewinsky stuff. So it was these years when everyone could feel good about their country. You know, we triumphed over communism. Look, we have these new young leaders who are, you know, they're for being conservative with money, but they're also very socially liberal. Isn't that so great? But obviously, what those two gave us is what leads to the rise of Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders today. So the neoliberalism that was spread across the globe by these two, you know, and by many other politicians, obviously does not benefit us at all. You know, my generation, we're going to have it so much worse than our parents' generation because of all these things, privatising industries, student loan debt going out of control, you know, wages stagnating and everything. This is the economic climate that these two people gave us, essentially. And the future looks pretty bleak for a lot of people my age. You know, I know we all make a joke about it a lot of the time. We're pretty self-deprecating about how shitty we're going to have it. But, you know, most of us won't own our own home, especially in the UK, because it's just so expensive. You know, I have a master's degree and, you know, I have pretty good job skills, but I'm finding it hard to find a job, and even, you know, the jobs I'm going for aren't particularly well paid, and they are in the field I'm looking for. So it's not been great for me, and I'm thinking about my future prospects. I'm thinking about trying to move out from my parents' house. I'm thinking about moving in with my girlfriend one day, but you're thinking about the funds, and then I was thinking about, how am I going to have kids on top of this? If my wages don't increase as much, how am I going to have kids and own up my own house? And the reality is, I'm never going to own my own house, and these kids are going to drain my bank account significantly. But not for the first time, but it's something now we have to really consider about, you know, kids are going to be such a burden on our finances to the point that we won't even be able to live properly. And with a Conservative government also being in power for the last 9 years in this country, slashing funding for the NHS, slashing funding in general for public services, privatising more industries. There's even talk now of privatising the NHS because the Americans want us to do it. We have all this stuff with Brexit. It's really not looking too great for us. And out of this context comes Jeremy Corbyn, someone who's been around for decades, for about 30-something years in the Commons, always in the background, asking Margaret Thatcher a question at PMQs, you know, being one of the leading speakers at the anti-Iraq war march in London. He's always been on the periphery, and now he comes into the mainstream because this is what people want. People are sick of these politicians, for example, who don't stand up for the working class, who abandon the people who voted for them, like Tony Blair. And this is the person we want now, someone who's straight talking, someone who doesn't just focus on what is hot and what's popular. He always focuses on what he believes, and he's genuine, he's consistent. That's why people like him, and that's why young people like myself like him. Even for a master's grad in London, one of the richest cities in the world, my future doesn't look that rosy. I would hate to see what my future would look like, or other people who don't have the benefit of a great education like me look like in maybe the north of England, where Tories have devastated, you know, time and again, where Labour really didn't help them with Tony Blair. I'd hate to see what my prospects would be over there in places in this country that have been neglected for decades. And that is the reality of it. And this is why Jeremy Corbyn is getting so popular, because the future looks bleak for so many of us now. And the good thing is, because of Brexit, the right wing are sort of eating each other, because the Brexit party is coming in and really taking support away from the Tories and the working class. There is a legit chance Jeremy Corbyn could lead a Labour government, and that is something that we would all want. And then in terms of America, it's a bit different, because you do have a similar thing to us. You have neoliberalism through Bill Clinton, you have all these communities devastated, but in America it goes so much deeper, because you don't even have things like universal healthcare. While our student loan debt is bad, you guys are paying, like, was it hundreds of thousands of pounds for university? And that's obscene, and people being crushed by this debt. And it's different as well, because in the UK, if you don't have the means to pay it back within 20 years, it gets written off. So I think it's, if you don't earn over 21k a year for 20 years. You don't have to pay this back. It just gets written off. And you guys don't have that. And you guys have a crazier right-wing party in a lot of ways because, you know, you've got this evangelical Christian movement. They give you people like Donald Trump. And you literally have Donald Trump plundering the country in front of you. And millions and millions and millions of people are defending him every day. He's actually making life worse for all of you. He's not even being realistic. He's not being smart in any sense. So America is pretty much way more fucked than we are. And the difference is as well is that you only have two parties and one of them doesn't even pretend to care about workers. One of them does pretend but doesn't do anything. So the Democrats, in my opinion, are right-wing and the Republicans are far-right. And that is just on a traditional European spectrum of politics. That's what they would be. But Americans are so crazy. They're calling like Nancy Pelosi crazy lefty and stuff. Are you serious? She's a corporatist right-winger. But because you're so far right at the moment, that is who you think is on the left. And honestly, unlike our country, which we do have anti-communist elements, but you know, this is pretty much the home of communism. Lenin, and in particular Marx, wrote a lot of his stuff here. And there hasn't been so much aversion to communism. But what also happened is that when communism was on the rise in Britain, the Labour movement took all the momentum out of it because what most communists wanted was represented by old school Labour. But in the US, you had these massive Red Scares in the 1920s and in the 1950s. So many people put on blacklists. You could even end up in prison for being a communist and stuff because you're so scared of the Soviet Union. And obviously it's the capitalist class in America being so scared of a group of people who wanted to fundamentally dismantle the system that benefits them so much. But just like Jeremy Corbyn, Bernie Sanders has been consistent. He's always been there in the background. You can go watch a speech in the 80s with him and he sounds exactly the same. He's always stood up for what he believes in. He's protested all these things like civil rights, for example, where Jeremy Corbyn was a protester against the apartheid regime in South Africa and the Tory government's support for it. So these people are just very, very genuine and they're born out of the economic conditions that hurt both of us. But obviously America's is way worse than the UK's because you don't even have some fundamental things like universal healthcare. But, you know, that is the context that these people are coming to power because people are sick of lying politicians, people are sick of the news media propping them up, people are sick of this whole system. And in America especially, it's more like you become a politician to get rich and then after you leave politics, you get a cushy job as a lobbyist. And that is the reality of American politics. The UK is fairly different in that regard. So the US system is fundamentally broken at its core, but then you have the current economic conditions in the world, especially the West, which have really given us Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. And what I'm hoping is that both of them will become leaders of their respective countries because that is really what we need right now. And it's really getting too late in terms of a lot of these things, in terms of mass poverty. You know, the UN saying that the UK and places like Alabama are some of the worst in the Western world. And in terms of things like climate change, we need people more radical on climate change to get into power because it's, you know, our generation and our kids' kids who are really going to suffer. A lot of these older people in politics right now, including Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn, it's never going to affect them. But obviously they're principled, so they actually care about these things, even though it won't affect them. So I'm hoping just as geopolitical considerations and economic conditions across the world gave us Reagan and Thatcher at the same time, gave us Bill Clinton and Tony Blair at a similar time, will also give us Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders at a similar time. Because of course they have given us these figures as leading politicians, but I'm hoping it will do us one better and make Jeremy Corbyn the Prime Minister and make Bernie Sanders the President. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. Please like the video and maybe consider subscribing to the channel. If you want to find me on social media, please follow me at The Tabernacle on both Twitter and Instagram. If you want to read some of my writing, look at my WordPress blog, which is just The Tabernacle WordPress. I also have a Patreon now, and the purpose of this Patreon is really to get funding for a new mic, a new camera, and maybe a green screen and a crane for my microphone. So go check that out, and I really appreciate everyone who's already given me some money for it and everyone who's donated in my live streams and stuff. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.